Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we are going to be reading true hurricane horror stories. I figure with Hurricane Idalia wreaking havoc in the South right now that this would be an appropriate video to make. My heart goes out to everyone who is affected by this storm, and because the storm is currently wreaking havoc, I've created a fundraiser for this video. This video is going to be part of a fundraiser that is raising money for Save the Children. Save the Children is currently working by responding and coordinating with local partners and first responders to understand potential needs of communities in the path of the storm. They've supported children and families in Florida following equally devastating hurricanes like Hurricane Ian, Michael, and Irma, and they are ready to support their long-lasting education, child care, and community partners as they face yet another catastrophic storm. If you would like to donate, please click the fundraiser button that YouTube will put somewhere below this video. It will be greatly appreciated, and you will be directly helping support children and families that are being affected by this devastating hurricane. Also, I would like to thank Spencer Dillehay for reading the first story in this video. Spencer is a professional voice actor and audiobook narrator, and he also runs a YouTube channel where he reads scary stories. The link for his channel will be in the description down below. Make sure you go check him out. And now, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories.
I was about 23, a British girl backpacking around the States alone. I'd been to NYC and taken the Amtrak down the East Coast and around Florida, with a ticket to fly out of Baton Rouge. No idea why I picked there. It sounded nice. I got to New Orleans, checked into the not-so hostel, and was tired, so crashed. Woke up the next day, did some touristy stuff, and generally relaxed. I had over a week, so was in no hurry. I was vaguely aware of the weather forecast, but didn't think it was a big deal. The next day, the hostel put up a sign saying, "Katrina is coming. Hurricanes mean party time in New Orleans. Get some beer, food, and water, and we'll board up the windows." Still not at all worried, I went to the supermarket and stocked up. Someone in my dorm was trying to leave the city and found out there were no buses or planes. The next day, there was a news report. The mayor, I think, who said everyone had to leave the city or go to a shelter. I still wasn't worried. A shelter seemed like it wouldn't be a big deal, so I packed my stuff with about a dozen other backpackers and went to the corner where we'd been told to wait. A bus picked us up and took us to the Superdome. At first, it was cool. There were loads of people, but it was pretty organized, and it seemed like an interesting new experience. I stuck with the other backpackers. We were pretty much the only white people in there, which seemed strange to us, but not bad. There were guards, but they were quite chilled. Everyone was really worried about protecting the AstroTurf, so we were really careful. We set up camp on the bleachers and went to sleep for the night. The storm started about 6 and woke us up. It was incredibly loud and ripped off bits of the roof. It was scary, but eventually it was over. I remember seeing beams of sunlight shining through the holes in the roof. That was day 2. Then things started to get scary. There were a lot of unwell people. I've no idea if it actually happened or was a mental health symptom. People were coming down off drugs, and I think I saw someone fall or jump off one of the balconies. Every day, more soldiers came in, with bigger, scarier guns. There were fights, and the whole place felt scary. There was no running water. We were trying to arrange to be transported out, so we went to meet with one of the army guys in charge. We went downstairs under the bleachers, where they were keeping all the really old, sick people. They were sitting in wheelchairs in 6 inches of water, and several seemed not far away from dying. After that, I stopped complaining and got on with it. After 6 days, they moved us to the basketball stadium for a night, then one of the big hotels. Every day they said they'd be getting us out today, and then we would have to stay. Finally, they got us on a bus. They wouldn't tell us where we were going, but we didn't much care. I remember the bus driver being the nicest man. I remember we were given the MRE meals and spent ages talking about food and what we missed. Then we were on the bus and we crossed the "Welcome to Texas" sign. And right there was a picnic/BBQ at the side of the road. We were talking about how amazing BBQ food would be, not realizing that they'd set it up for us. From that day on, Texas was my favorite state. We got taken to Dallas after then, and the embassy put me up in a hotel for the night and bought me waffles and some clothes. There's more, but it's late here now and I can't think. If anyone's interested, ask questions, and I'll try and answer them.
Hey everyone, Interscare here. And for my first story of this video, since we're going to be talking about hurricane stories and things in this video, I want to give my own personal account of my time during Hurricane Sandy. Now, I don't have this written down or anything, so I'm just kind of talking into the microphone as I remember things. I actually have already been reading a bunch of these stories, and I moved them forward in the video because it brought back a lot of memories of my time. So I was 15 years old when Hurricane Sandy hit, and I wasn't in New York or New Jersey at the time, but I did live in a little town in West Virginia. At the time, my family and I lived in a double-wide trailer, so with the storm coming, we decided that probably wasn't the best place to be. So we ended up going to my uncle's house, who lived down in the valley between 2 mountains. To get down to his house, you had to drive about 2 miles down switchbacks, straight down a mountain with no guardrail blocking. So we went down there before the storm hit. And whenever the storm hit, it was much worse than we could have even imagined. We went outside and there was 5 feet of snow. We literally had to dig out the door just so that we could go outside. We lost power. We didn't have any internet, no electricity. The only heat that we had was my uncle's wood furnace that he had in his living room. He also only had well water. And with the storm, that well water was absolutely disgusting. So we didn't have any running water to drink. We were stuck in his house for about a week. Mind you, this was a 3-bedroom home, and my family, I'm the oldest of 5, and in his family, he had 4 kids himself. So it was 9 kids and 4 adults, all huddled together in a 3-bedroom house for an entire week. When we ran out of bottled water, we had to go get snow from outside and boil it on the wood furnace, just so that we could have water to drink. For food, all we had was canned foods, which I guess is a good thing to have during the storm, but we had no way of heating it up other than just opening the can and setting it on top of the wood furnace in hopes of it heating it up just enough for us to be able to eat it. My grandparents didn't come with us to my uncle's house. They had stayed at their home. They lived right across the yard from where our double wide was, but we had no way of contacting them. I didn't know if my grandpa was alive or if he had deceased in the storm. We didn't know anything. Finally, after about a week of us being stuck in this house, me, my dad, my uncle, and my uncle's oldest son, who is a few years younger than myself, all decided that we would try our best to clean up the trees and all that stuff that had fallen on the switchbacks getting out of his house. My uncle had a tractor that we all piled into, my dad and my uncle sitting in the seats and me and my cousin riding on the sides holding on. He would drive it up the switchback, and he would stop every 5 feet or so that me, my dad, and my cousin could go move fallen trees from the path. The tractor was pushing the snow out of the way, trying to clear the road enough for us to get our minivans up there. Finally, after about 8 or 9 hours of nothing but hard labor trying to get this switchback cleaned up, it was finally clear enough where my uncle and my dad finally felt comfortable trying to get these minivans up there. So, my family all piled into our minivan, his family into his, and we started our ascent up this switchback. Remember, like I said before, there are no guardrails. If you slip off the switchback, you're falling straight down a mountain. And it was scary because these roads were slick. There were several times that my dad had to fight to keep control of the vehicle and not let it slide off the road. But we finally got up. And when we got out, we saw the devastation that had hit the top of the mountain. There were fallen trees everywhere. Power lines were down. It was desolate. And there was nobody around at the time because even a week later, it was still too dangerous to get out and even start working on things. We worked our way back to our house, and we finally got to see my grandparents. They were alive and well, but they weren't thriving. They didn't have power either, even though they lived closer to town. The only way that they could keep refrigerator stuff cold was by throwing it all outside in the snow. I remember seeing gallons of milk, eggs, deer meat from our previous hunting season, and everything just thrown outside on the porch in the snow because that was the only way to keep it cold. My grandpa had a generator, but it soon ran out of gas, and there were no gas stations that had any gas available at the time. It was a very, very rough couple of weeks until the snow finally melted, power lines were able to be restored, and things finally got back to normal. And I say all that to say this, because I wasn't even in New York or New Jersey. I was miles and miles away in West Virginia. So I couldn't even imagine what it would be like being in one of the cities where these hurricanes hit and devastate thousands and thousands of people's homes and lives. My heart goes out to everyone who is affected by these storms. I hope each and every one of you that live in an area that is affected by Hurricane Idalia, please be safe. I was 21 years old. We evacuated, but came back very quickly because my dad's a contractor. We stayed with friends just outside of the city and had special passes that were given to people like contractors, people who were coming in to work on cleaning up, that were inspected by the National Guard on the way in every day. It was eerie. We could drive all the way from one end of Veterans Highway, a large road right outside of New Orleans proper, but still in the impacted vicinity, in the suburbs, normally lousy with traffic, to the other, and not see another car, person, working light, or even living thing. It was desolate, like a wasteland. I remember it took a long time for places to start feeling occupied again, because so many were gone. It took years for some 24-hour places to work up the staff to be able to run for 24 hours again. I was 11 when Hurricane Katrina came knocking. I had never spent more than a week outside of New Orleans. I remember being in school a week before it hit. The administration handed out a "in case this crap storm messes us up" form, and I remember immediately throwing it in the trash. Every year I could remember a hurricane had threatened the city. We'd gotten no worse than a drizzle. We evacuated the Saturday before it struck, and I still didn't think much of it, even when we were stuck in traffic for 12 hours, trying to drive 2 hours west to Lafayette. It wasn't until we saw the videos of the levees breaking that I understood just how serious the situation was. My mother was crying hysterically. She had lived in New Orleans her whole life. I was simply stunned. I saw the photos of my school and my house under 8 feet of water. My dad was a consultant, but all of his clients were underwater, so we were suddenly poor. My family of 7 was stuck in the same 2-bed hotel room for 2 months. We never went hungry because the local churches had put together food drives for the refugees. After a time, it became clear that we could not go back. We had nothing to go back to anymore. So we settled down in the city that we evacuated to. My mom would take me to a local church and just pray for hours for all the people who needed help. The priest was this venerable old guy who personally introduced himself to all of the refugees. When we told him that we were still living in a hotel 2 months after the storm, he let us stay in a house that the church owned for almost nothing. He even let us attend the Catholic school for no charge for an entire year. It was really moving how the entire church banded together to help us out when we needed it. I remember being absolutely angry at the government. All that FEMA money only went to the poor and uninsured. I don't resent the poor at all because they needed it, but the poor weren't the only ones. My middle-class, tax-paying, flood insurance-owning family never got crap from them. Never mind that the insurance agency was underwater too, and we didn't get compensation of any kind until the day after my 13th birthday. Never mind that we had to go up to our eyeballs in debt just to survive because our assets drowned with the banks. It's been almost 10 years since it happened. I don't think I'll ever trust the government or view it as competent again. When we really needed it, the government failed us on every possible level. The churches did more for us than any government official did. This came out a lot angrier than I intended. I guess I'm still bitter about the whole thing, but it's not easy to lose your home, your way of life, and all your friends in a single day. I'm from Biloxi, Missouri, and our families have ridden out every storm that we have ever gotten, Katrina included. I had just turned 19 and was home for the weekend from college. I had no idea that there was a storm, so I brought my dirty clothes home and left everything else at school in my dorm. I will never forget my mama running into my room Sunday morning saying, "It's a Category 5. I was like, what the heck? I'm going back to sleep. We stayed up all day boarding up the windows and getting our stuff packed to go around the corner to my paternal grandmother's house. Our house was surrounded by trees and she had a generator. Mama was on the phone with her mom begging her to leave. She lived on the point in Biloxi. Basically, her house was in between the Gulf of Mexico and Biloxi Back Bay. After hours of crying and begging, she was off to Tallahassee to stay with my uncle. My aunt, other uncle, and 2 little cousins were in tow. Once they were gone, we loaded up our stuff and our animals and went up the road. Honestly, I slept through the entire night when it hit. I was thinking I was going to wake up. We would clean the yards and just go about our lives. I was wrong. Really wrong. Since we lived north of I-10, our houses were fine. However, everything else was completely devastated. The Grand Casino in Biloxi was setting on the north side of Highway 90. The water had picked an entire casino up and moved it across the beach and north of the highway. My mama's mom, my maternal grandmother, lost everything that she has ever owned. She had a little shotgun house, and it was picked up and full of water. We went into the house and got some of her knickknacks, salvaged some clothes, and looked for our papa's service flag. The day we found his flag was the last day we ever went to that house. Another casino has since been built on her property. It's a gym now or something. Seeing the point completely obliterated was absolutely heart-shattering. The place I had lived my whole life was decimated. We cried and cried, but we lived. We did what we had to do. The coast was never the same after the storm, but we're building back slowly but surely. I love Biloxi. It's my home. I hate that it didn't get the attention it needed. Heck, none of the coast did. But you know what? We rallied together. We all became a big family, and we are now thriving. I pray that this kind of storm will never happen again. I was a year out of college and had just moved back to the North Shore area about 4 weeks before the storm hit. When the call came to evacuate, I packed up with my family and 4 other families that we were very close with to caravan out of the area. We evacuated, but finding a place to stay was troublesome. We wound up going all the way to Northeast Texas, where we stayed in a campground for 2 nights, before going to a friend of a cousin's lake house near Oklahoma. We stayed for about 4 more days before we heard rumors that you could get back down south. Mind you, there was no cellular service much past Baton Rouge for a while. There was significant storm damage and power outages as far north as Natchitoches, Louisiana. So we drove to Jackson, Mississippi, and of all things, stayed at a lovely B&B for 2 nights while we tried to get supplies. Mind you, Jackson is almost 200 miles north of New Orleans, and every store was either very low or completely out of gasoline, candles, batteries, bottled water, generators, lanterns, chainsaws, and most non-perishable food. We wound up finding a small mom-and-pop hardware store that sold oil lamps and lamp oil. So we bought all of those, about 3 dozen lamps and all the lamp oil and wicks that they had. Then we started to drive south. If you've ever driven down I-55 in Mississippi, you may be familiar with the invasive kudzu plant that covers everything. All the trees, bushes, plants, etc. The closer we got to Louisiana, the more you could see the trees start to bed from wind, and the kudzu was disturbed. It was very odd. We made it as far as Washington Parish before we hit roadblocks. This was about 10 days after the storm, give or take. From Washington Parish to St. Tammany Parish, we wound our way on the back roads via a good old-fashioned road atlas. There was no power, no gasoline stations, nothing was open, and there was just endless storm damage. Roofs were blown down, trees were scattered everywhere, and the ones still standing had been blown to almost a 50-degree angle. There was localized flooding, and worst of all, lots of downed power lines. When we got to one of the family's houses, we stopped. It was on a lot of land, and we could all hang out together. No one knew how long it would take to get to the lake. There was no cell service, no radio, obviously no telephone or television service. When the sun went down, it was just dark. But there was plenty to do. The house had suffered minor damage, but the property was a mess. I learned how to use a chainsaw. Every day was spent working from the time the sun came up until it went down. We cleared the driveway, the property, and then went to work with the rest of the community that had started to come back and worked on clearing the roads. This was in late summer, and late summer in Louisiana without AC is not a fun time. But every day was so physically demanding that we slept like logs. Every other day we sent a few people to find more water, gasoline, and food. They once came to a Red Cross station near Covington. They reported that there were at least 500 people there. and by 10 a.m., all the supplies had run out. I saw fights over 5-pound bags of ice at a Red Cross station, MREs, also Red Cross station, gasoline purchases, D batteries, and most heartbreaking, I saw people abandoning their pets because they weren't able to care for them. My dad was working abroad, and as soon as he could, he flew to Dallas, then Houston, then rented a car and drove across I-10 with an SUV filled with bottled water and a generator that he found near Beaumont, Texas. The generator was used to cool the refrigerator and run fans at night. It was so hot that summer. 3 weeks after the storm, we could navigate most of St. Tammany Parish well enough, and by that point, things were in full swing. Stores were getting deliveries, power lines were being repaired, roads were being constantly cleared, etc. The bridge from Slidell to New Orleans had been damaged and was unusable. Homes and buildings along the lake were in toothpick-sized shards. It was easily visible where the storm surge had hit and how far the water levels rose from the lake. There was a huge spike in crime in an otherwise very safe and suburban community along the North Shore. There was constant looting, reports of shootings. Fights in stores were downright commonplace. It was a really horrible time. People lost all their things, which, sure, it's just stuff. But it isn't easy to rationalize that when 3 generations of heirlooms and keepsakes have been destroyed, along with their home, their neighborhood, and their community. I didn't know about what happened in the Superdome and Convention Center for weeks. I didn't know that there had been a huge telethon to raise money until almost a year later. I didn't know for almost 6 months if all my friends had survived. But let us also not forget that this storm hit the Gulf Coast, not just New Orleans. Coastal Mississippi was devastated, and only a few weeks after the storm, Hurricane Rita gave the far west Gulf Coast its own major storm. I have to make sure to recognize all the road, power, telecom, etc. crews that came from all over the nation to help get people in the area connected and moving again. The other thing I want to call out is the illness that has plagued the community since the storm. I don't have any scientific data or even a great knowledge of things, but in my own personal inner circle, the instances of cancer since the storm would blow your mind. Mostly men and women who were older than 45 when the storm hit, and all kinds of cancer all along the Gulf Coast, especially in adults of all ethnicities. I don't know what gets stirred up. Well, everything does, I suppose, during these storms. But I'm not exaggerating when I say that more than 75% of the adults that I know/knew suffered serious health complications after the storm. Here's my takeaway. FEMA obviously didn't have a plan before this storm, and they still aren't great. Looking at Hurricane Sandy survivors, the Red Cross can only do as much as it possibly can. This stuff brings out the worst in people, and I love my family and friends. I was 8 when Hurricane Katrina hit. It was my first real big hurricane. We were supposed to evacuate, but my grandfather opted to stay because he said that he had rode out similar big storms back in the day, so we stayed. It was strange, because at 4 a.m., 2 hours before the storm hit, you could see the rats, roaches, anything that's able to climb vertically, crawling up the telephone poles to get to high ground. The storm started at 6 a.m., when it slowly started to flood. No winds just yet. By around 10, all of our furniture floated out of the house. In the house was me, my mom, my grandparents, and my aunt. I was in the attic with my mom, while my grandparents and aunt were downstairs on top of the stove. My grandparents couldn't climb the ladder to get in the attic. The storm knocked down my buddy's house. They were in the attic too. Unfortunately, they didn't make it. It stopped around 7 p.m. We slept on someone's porch for the night. Then we got a boat to a bridge and slept there for 3 days and 2 nights. Finally, we caught a bus to a different city. It was crazy for an 8-year-old. When I finish high school, I'm moving away for college. I will never experience that again. I was a sophomore in high school when Katrina hit. The last day of school that we had was August 26th, and the thing is that no one said goodbye to each other. None of us could have guessed that the majority of us wouldn't see each other again. Many people were skeptical about the impact that Katrina would cause, because just about a year prior, Hurricane Ivan was supposed to hit New Orleans straight on, and it ended up turning at the last moment to hit Florida. People didn't want to spend the extra money evacuating. My family did evacuate to northeastern Alabama, with the exception of my brother who had to stay. He was a police officer. I know, the police officer, at least in my parish, weren't getting fed. My brother ended up getting out and had to get transported to Baton Rouge. I enrolled in school in Alabama for 3 weeks. All the people were nice. My family then left for Louisiana, but another city, just north of New Orleans. I enrolled in 2 more schools that year, a grand total of 4 schools my sophomore year. Needless to say, I didn't make any attachments. In October, my area was finally open to the former residents, so we went and salvaged a few things. The only area of my house that didn't have water was the attic. All of our photos were ruined, with the exception of Polaroids. Great film. There were houses in the middle of several streets. One, I had no idea where it came from. Vehicles and boats were on top of houses. It was a very sad thing, but I had prepared myself for it, since I had 2 months to wonder how it all looked. I will say that following the hurricane, there was a huge sense of community. People would help each other. Every single business opening was a celebration. I later moved closer to Baton Rouge my junior, and I've been there ever since. I haven't been back home in 2 years, because I have no reason to go. I didn't live in New Orleans. I lived in Long Beach, Missouri. I could throw a baseball from the front door of my apartment and have it land in the Gulf of Mexico, if the wind wasn't against me. A coworker that lived in the same apartment complex as I did went to Hawaii on his honeymoon. The storm hit while he was in Hawaii, and I don't know how, but he had no idea that it had happened. He returned home to a wasteland. My apartment manager decided to stay with her boyfriend to ride out the storm. Shortly before the storm hit, they got into a big argument about something. She got mad and returned to her home in the apartment complex. Sometime in the middle of the storm, she got a call through to her mother. "I'm on the 2nd floor. The water is still rising." And she disconnected. Her body was never found. I was able to stay with my sister-in-laws, about an hour north of the beach for the storm. The eye of the hurricane passed over us while I was there. I went outside during it, looked around. We picked up some debris to move it away from the house before we were back in the thick of things. My parents live about a half an hour drive away from my sister-in-laws. Of course, the first thing my sister and I wanted to do was to go see if our parents were okay. It took us 2 days to get there because of all the trees that had blown over in the road. My brother-in-law and I were trying to get there in a mule, kind of like a golf cart, but 4-wheel drive and gas-powered. So we had to cut a lot of trees out of the road with a chainsaw. We had no idea what to expect, so we carried shotguns with us everywhere we went. Luckily, we never even came close to needing them. After 2 days, we finally made it to my parents' house, but they weren't there. We left the mule, hid the extra can of gasoline, and started hiking to my parents' closest neighbors. When I was in 5th and 6th grade, I was always at the neighbor's house, as I was very good friends with their son and daughter, Stephen and Elise. Normally, it's a 10 to 15 minute walk to get there, but it took about a half an hour on this particular day because of the trees in the road. We made it there. I'd have to be the one to call Stephen and Elise. In the next couple of days, my brother-in-law, a friend of his, Jeremy, that lived near where I did, and I made it back down to the coast to see if there was anything that we could recover. We had to park on the side of the road, north of Jeremy's apartment complex. After a short hike, we made it to the complex, and things looked to be not so bad. There was a lot of damage, but overall not so bad. Then we walked around to the side of the building that was blocking our view. We were staring at a roof. A roof. An intact roof. It was on the ground, in front of us. It was removed from the top of a 3-story apartment building and placed gingerly on the ground. So we climbed over it, and then we saw it. Devastation. Destroyed buildings, and a crying girl. The girl was in a room, or at least what used to be a room. But now it wasn't really a room anymore. It was like a picture from World War II, where you see a shelled building, missing walls, but you still see a kitchen with furniture. I think we saw her in her bedroom. I think I remember seeing a bed and some other furniture. But she was alone and crying. I'm ashamed that I didn't try to see if she was okay. We proceeded to where Jeremy's apartment was. It was gone. Just a concrete slab with pipes sticking up out of the ground. It was actually kind of clean. The water had washed everything away. We didn't even bother going back to my apartment. I was closer to the water than Jeremy was. After a week or so of staying at my sister-in-law's, we all decided to evacuate to Houston. Roads were finally clearing up, but local grocery stores were running low on food. So we packed up what we could and we left. When we were a good bit west of New Orleans, we drove around it, not through it, I finally got cell signal. I spent at least an hour just dialing, over and over, Elise's number. I finally got through. Elise was on the phone with her mom when the line went dead. The last thing her mom had said to her was that she thought she heard a tornado. It was probably the tornado that took out the line. Elise was hysterical, but she calmed down quickly when I told her that her parents were okay. They were worried sick about what Elise and Steven had to assume, based on the line going dead when it did. My parents were okay too. They were all over there drinking and having a grand time. So that's my story. My family and I are from New Orleans, though I was in Chicago when Katrina hit. Coincidentally, my parents were up in Chicago visiting me when Katrina hit as well. I'm thankful for this, not just because they were out of town, but because I know my dad, and I know that he would have been stubborn and would have wanted to stay. After the storm, my parents left me to go back south. They drove up to Chicago and stayed in Memphis for a week, then went down to Mendeville, Louisiana, to stay with my aunt and uncle until the city was reopened. In the meantime, they were concerned for their place, a condo in the warehouse district, and an amazing thing happened. I had been following the blog of an IT guy at an ISP in New Orleans, an ex-Marine who decided to stay at his company downtown and keep the servers and everything up and running. I don't really know how, but he arranged shipments of fuel for the generators for the servers, and water and food, I assume, for him and a few others that stayed with him. Anyway, he and the other few guys would go out on patrol around the building where they were working and living to keep an eye on the neighborhood, since the cops were nowhere to be found at the time. He'd write up reports of his patrols, which I had been reading, and it turned out that he was only a block or two from my parents' place. I contacted him and asked if he'd eyeball the building if they patrolled down that street. He was able to report back that the street hadn't flooded and that the front door was still intact, so it hadn't been looted. So, from Chicago, I was able to report back to my parents that their home was still intact, despite the fact that they couldn't get back to it for almost a month following the storm. It was so frustrating being in Chicago, seeing everything that was happening to my home and being unable to do anything about it or to help anyone. But thanks to the internet and that one tenacious IT guy, I was at least able to provide my parents with some comfort. And that at least felt good. My family and I was trapped in downtown New Orleans, across from the Superdome during Katrina, for 6 days, and we eventually evacuated via a Black Hawk helicopter. I worked on downtown New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, doing maintenance, and I was on my employer's hurricane emergency response team. Basically, we were to evacuate to our work and just stay there on the clock watching over everything. When it became a Category 5 overnight, we were given the option to leave, but most, if not all of us, elected to stay rather than get trapped on the road. Needless to say, it got pretty bad. There were over 100 of us there, and most did not bring adequate food, water, and supplies. By the 5th day, it started getting Lord of the Flies, and I really started getting concerned for me and my family's safety. On the 6th day, the Army came and evacuated us all via Blackhawks to New Orleans Airport, which was hell on earth. My employer sent buses to bring us to our headquarters in Baton Rouge. From there, we were transferred to the Louisiana State Police Barracks, where chow hall food and porta showers were the best thing ever. We wound up staying with a family in Baton Rouge for 2 weeks until I could secure transportation out of Louisiana. While we were there, we found our apartment in Slidell completely destroyed on Google Maps. Everything turned out for the best though. Insurance paid off on everything. Renter's policy with exactly 2 premiums paid. And with that and FEMA, we were able to put a down payment on a house, and I was able to go back to school and completely change my career. I was a 36-year-old freshman at the local community college, and then to a university majoring in IT. I am now a corporate IT director. It was a long 6 days, and we saw quite a few things that could take me hours to type here. The Superdome was as hellish as everyone had heard. We heard snipers firing on helicopters attempting to evacuate patients from Mercy Hospital. We saw roving patrols of tactical teams and airboats patrolling the flooded streets of New Orleans hunting looters. I saw boat after boat of victims, most of them children with notes pinned to their clothes, assumedly for when they were found, being offloaded at University Hospital, and a few bodies just randomly floating by. That's just a few. I wrote a paper on this in English composition when I went back to school, and it was 12 pages fully typed out. We got the whole experience. I went back the day the city was open to retrieve our cars from the parking garage. The bridge over Pontchartrain was out, so we had to go to Baton Rouge and come back in. It took 17 hours total to get from Mobile, Alabama to New Orleans and back. It was very post-apocalyptic. The streets were deserted except for military vehicles at intersections, and dead/flooded cars were all bulldozed into piles in the center and sides of the roads. Creepiest thing that I've ever seen. This is a story from a friend that I met a few years ago. I live in Baton Rouge, and he was in the New Orleans Parish Jail when Katrina made landfall. From what he's told me, all of the guards literally abandoned the jail and left the prisoners to fend for themselves. He said that they thought that it would be possible to wait it out, as everyone knows waiting it out was the worst possible idea, and the levee broke and the jail started flooding. So, they had to start ramming the doors with their beds. Fortunately, him and the others were able to bust down enough doors to get the roof and signal for help. A boat or helicopter, I can't remember, it's been a while since he told me the story, came and got them. The prisoners that made it were saved and evacuated to wherever they wanted. He went to Texas, and when the smoke had cleared, he was cleared of all charges, and pretty much told not to mention what had happened. I was 21, in my 4th year at Loyola University of New Orleans when Katrina hit. I grew up and lived in Kenner at the time, which is a suburb of New Orleans. When Katrina was about to hit, absolutely nobody that I knew took it seriously. That might sound ridiculous, but when hurricanes threaten annually and nothing ever really happens, then their ferocity lessens on you. I remember going clubbing the Friday night before, talking to my friends about the hurricane, and we all agreed to evacuate to Baton Rouge, bring only a few days of clothes, get hammered, then drive back to NOLA when everything cleared up. Holy cow, were we wrong about that. On the Sunday before it hit, we realized how serious this was, and we were scrambling for food, water, and supplies. I cooked up tons of chicken, but of course my drunk college student friends ate it all before the hurricane even came. There were 7 of us, crammed in a 2-bedroom townhouse, and we waited for the hurricane to come. The next morning, we watched the news on my battery-powered TV set. The first report we saw was for my neighborhood. There was a Sam's Club building right off my exit, and because the TV was in black and white, I couldn't understand why it seemed like the bottom half of the building was missing. Then it hit me that it flooded up to the roof, and that my house was most likely flooded. The next report we saw was for Biloxi, Missouri, and then my friend screamed out in anguish. The TV showed his neighborhood, but it was absolutely flattened and his house was missing. Later, he learned that his elderly mother had to climb a tree to escape the floodwaters. We were stuck to the TV, drinking to forget and chain smoking the stress away. A few days later, one of the owners of the apartment, John, got a call from his father, a doctor, who had to stay back at hospital in New Orleans East. He got word that his father and another family were being evacuated by helicopter to Baton Rouge, and that he needs to pick them up. When his father and the family got to the apartment, the husband and wife broke down in tears. We didn't even know them and they embraced us, thanking us for letting them stay the night. After they calmed down, the husband told us the story of their week in hell. The husband, wife, and their 2 little daughters were stuck at the hospital when it flooded. They had to wade in knee-high water for a week with no showers while doctors and nurses tried to care for patients with the only backup generator. It was a hot, humid Louisiana summer. All the while, junkies and looters would try to break into the hospital. There were constant shootouts between the criminals and the police, barricading the entrance with their squad cars. They were terrified for their lives, and especially for their little girls. After a week, they were finally evacuated. I stayed a total of 2 weeks in Baton Rouge at a friend's house. I did go back to my house after the first week to check it out and grab some things. And yes, it had flooded 3 feet. The stench of rotting, molding wood that assaulted me when I first opened the door will never leave me. My mother was also stuck, working at a hospital in Medevac, but she fared a lot better than the New Orleans East people. I stopped by her office, gave her a teary goodbye, and then drove to Houston, where I would take a flight to Richmond, Virginia, and live with my sister for the semester. In Richmond, VCU let me schedule all of the classes that I wanted and gave me free supplies and textbooks. I really appreciated the care that VCU showed me because I desperately needed it. While I lived there, I was interviewed by the local news twice, and random people around town would come talk to me, which was pretty cool. I'm not a survivor, necessarily, but when they bused the evacuees to Houston, I went down to the Astrodome, where they were housing them all, to volunteer. They had put out a call for people to bring their laptops down to help people enter their information into databases and look up people they lost contact with. 2 things stick with me. First, all of those news stations and nonprofits who like to set up their own missing persons database after a natural disaster really need to stop. They cost us hundreds of hours. There's an official Red Cross database, but of course, instead of just searching that, we had to search 20 other databases that everyone trying to help had set up, because who knows where their loved ones had registered. Sorry, that's just aggravated me to this day. The story that will really stick with me until the end of my life, though, is there was one old man. He must have been in his 60s or 70s, and he came up to me, wanting to find his daughter or son. I can't remember. So I gave him a piece of paper to fill out with a bunch of information, like name, date of birth, address, relationship, that I could take and put into the databases that we were searching. I handed him the paper, and he just sort of stood there and looked at me. I looked back at him, not getting it at all. He didn't say anything. He just kind of stood there. The girl sitting next to me got it more quickly than I did and leaned over to whisper in my ear, "He can't read or write." I just remember this gulf suddenly opened up in my mind between us. This old guy and me, a young white grad student that had our life experiences, were so different that I couldn't even conceive of the fact that he might not know how to read or write. It was one of the most human and humbling experiences of my life. I also want to read this reply to that story. I volunteered at the Astrodome too. Two things. The guy from the hood, someone I would have been afraid of in other circumstances, who came up and thanked me, a middle-aged white woman, and all of Houston for being so friendly and helpful. You're right. It was a real visceral moment when two people from different worlds connected. Second, I'd taken a bunch of my kids' outgrown toys to donate when I saw a family walking across the Astrodome parking lot with 3 little kids. I pulled up next to them and opened the back, and I told them that they could each pick out whatever they wanted. The kids were very shy. They were shell-shocked, but they each carefully chose a toy and held on to it for dear life, and then they kept walking. I flew with a Medevac crew. It's basically an Army air ambulance from nearby Fort Polk, assisting in the evacuation of the city for days after Hurricane Katrina. We dropped water and food to people living in their attics through holes in their roofs. We went into a nursing home to check for survivors, and all there were dead bodies that swelled and rotted in the heat and humidity. One of the young guys on our crew had to take a couple of days off after that. We pulled out a man near downtown with an alligator bite in his right leg. We evacuated a family with all of their luggage and a dog in a carrier. 2 of the women had 3 to 4 rings on all of their fingers. I can only imagine where they got them. One of the only fun moments was when we saw a man rolling a bulldozer through the water. We waved to him to see if he was okay, and he waved back and smiled. We soon realized that he was rolling right toward a bank. We just let him go. A few of us ended up with PTSD after that. As bad as the news made it look, it was 10 times worse in real life. The city smelled like death from the swamp water, natural gas leaks, and bodies in the houses in the water. I still have dreams about it once in a while that I'll never forget. This isn't my story. Katrina happened when I was in high school. We lived in northern Louisiana. So after the disaster, we had a lot of refugees living in our city. My parents decided that they wanted to volunteer to help these people, which is cool. So my dad and I show up at this old school gymnasium where a lot of folks were taking refuge and such. The awkward part about it was that they had so many volunteers at this point that there really wasn't enough work for everyone. We ended up getting put in the shower area, basically just handing out shower supplies and making sure that it didn't get crazy in there. Well, this one guy comes in and sits down with us and starts talking. He didn't go through the showers or anything, so we figured that he just needed someone to listen to him. So he starts talking about how he lived in the middle of New Orleans when the storm hit. Apparently, he was completely against evacuating and decided to hold up in his house with his wife and newborn until the storm passed. Said he'd been through a few of them already, and it probably wouldn't be a big deal. Well, as we all know, it was a big deal, and it soon became too late for him to get out. His house flooded completely, up to the 2nd floor, and they were trapped. Not sure how long that they were there for, and I'm not sure how it happened, but he said at some point his wife and child died, so he's stuck in this house with their bodies for some untold amount of time before rescuers arrive. They try to evacuate him out of his house, but I guess that he was overcome with grief and had gone a bit crazy because he said that he refused to go with them and was even threatening them with a shotgun to stay away. While trying to fend them off, the roof of his house collapsed in on him, and he finally gave up and let him take him. Both my dad and I listened to this story, and neither of us really knew what to say to him. After this, I wasn't very thrilled about volunteering anymore. I have a lot of mixed feelings about it, and I'm not even sure how much truth is in it. But regardless, it has stuck with me for a very long time. Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them. I also hope that you enjoy the extra rain at the end. Please, everyone, if you're in an area that is being affected by Hurricane Idalia, stay safe. And if you would like to donate to help support relief for Hurricane Idalia victims, remember, the fundraiser is on this video. The money will be going to Save the Children, an organization that is currently helping with families and children that are being victims of Hurricane Idalia. And I hope that each and every one of you get an excellent night's sleep. Good night, everybody, and I'll read to you in the next video.